There is a plant growing right now in places where nothing else survives, on the frozen edges of the Himalayas, on the crumbling coastal dunes of northern Europe, in the salt, poisoned floodplains of Central Asia, where the soil looks more like chalk than earth. It grows there without irrigation, without fertilizer, without human attention of any kind. It has been doing this for millions of years, and most people alive today have never heard its name. That is not an accident. What happened to this plant is not a story of neglect. It is a story of incompatibility. What grows freely, what refuses to be contained, what demands no purchase agreement and yields no patent, that kind of plant has no place in the architecture of the modern food system. It was not forgotten the way a song is forgotten. It was made inconvenient, and inconvenience over enough generations becomes erasure. The plant is called sea buckthorn, and it has been waiting longer than any of us have been counting. This channel exists to open vaults, not the vaults of governments or corporations, the vaults of time, those slow accumulating archives where indigenous knowledge, ancient agriculture, and ecological memory are stored, often just barely before the last people who hold that knowledge are gone. If you are here for the first time, consider staying. What we preserve together matters more than what any single person remembers alone. Subscribe and become part of the archive. Now, let us go back to a place that existed before borders did. In the high-altitude river valleys of the Tibetan Plateau, somewhere between the Karakoram and the Hindu Kush, the first known human relationships with sea buckthorn were formed. The plant grows there in dense, impenetrable thickets, its branches silver gray and armored with thorns like iron needles, its berries clustered so tightly along the stems that the branches themselves seem to disappear beneath them, orange and amber and a deep burning gold, depending on the altitude and the season. The Tibetan name for it is shaji. In traditional Tibetan medicine, it appears in texts dating back over 1,000 years under the system known as Soa Rigpa, the science of healing. It was not categorized as food, nor purely as medicine. It occupied a space those categories cannot contain. It was considered a complete substance, something that restored what prolonged hardship had taken. Mongolian horsemen fed the berries and leaves to their horses before long campaigns. The animals came back stronger, their coats changed. The practice was observed, recorded, and passed down not in books, but in the oral traditions of cavalry culture, in the accumulated knowledge of people who understood that what kept an animal alive in a Mongolian winter was probably worth understanding. In the Siberian regions of Russia, the indigenous Altai people called it a blepika. The name means, roughly, covered in something stuck. If you have ever tried to harvest sea buckthorn by hand, the name makes immediate sense. The berries do not release easily. They adhere, they resist separation. Even the plant, in some fundamental way, refuses to let go of what it has made. What cannot be stored in a container and sold at a predictable margin cannot hold the attention of an industrial food chain. Beyond the logistics, there is a subtler force at work. Sea buckthorn is not ownable in the way modern agriculture requires ownership. You cannot prevent a neighbor from harvesting the same wild species. You cannot patent a nitrogen-fixing thicket that has been growing on a riverbank since before any living person was born. The plant exists outside the systems that would need to profit from it in order to distribute it. And so the systems, quietly and without announcement, moved on to other things. The science, however, did not move on. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating significantly in the first 2 decades of this century, sea buckthorn became the subject of serious academic attention across Europe, Asia, and eventually North America. Studies published in peer-reviewed journals documented its anti-inflammatory properties, its wound healing capacity when applied topically, particularly relevant for burns and radiation damage, its apparent role in supporting liver function, its effect on cardiovascular markers in clinical populations. A 2017 study published in the journal Food Chemistry analyzed the full antioxidant profile of sea buckthorn across multiple varieties and found concentrations of bioactive compounds that researchers described as among the highest recorded in any temperate climate fruit. A 2020 review in Nutrients examined decades of clinical and laboratory research and concluded that the plant warranted serious investigation as a functional food in the management of metabolic disease. What was being discovered was not new. It was old, translated into a language the modern world would accept. The Tibetan physicians who cataloged it 1,000 years ago were not practicing superstition. They were practicing a form of empiricism, one that operated without mass spectrometers or peer review, but arrived at conclusions that have now been confirmed by both. In some European countries, particularly in Germany, Finland, and the Baltic states, sea buckthorn carries a complicated emotional weight. It grew abundantly along coastlines and riverbanks throughout the 20th century. During the post-war period, it appeared in jams and juices in regions where imported citrus was unavailable or unaffordable. It was survival food, and survival food, in the memory of people who lived through deprivation, does not always become beloved. It becomes associated with the time when there was nothing else. A generation that grew up eating sea buckthorn jam because there was nothing else to eat raised children who wanted nothing to do with sea buckthorn jam. The forgetting was not random. It was a deliberate turning away from the evidence of hardship. The plant was not erased by policy. It was put down quietly by people who had suffered and wanted their children to suffer differently. This is how much knowledge dies, not by fire, by the simple human desire to move forward. We are now in a different kind of crisis. Soil degradation affects roughly a third of the world's arable land. Fresh water scarcity is accelerating. The agricultural systems that replaced ancient food knowledge are increasingly fragile, dependent on stable climates, cheap fossil fuels, and supply chains that the last several years have demonstrated can collapse with startling speed. The crops that dominate global food production were selected for yield and transportability, not for resilience. They require conditions that the coming decades may not provide. Sea buckthorn requires almost nothing. It asks only for poor soil, wind, and time. In exchange, it gives back nitrogen. It gives back ground cover. It gives back a food source of genuinely unusual nutritional density, available in precisely the marginal landscapes that modern agriculture has written off as unproductive. It has already survived ice ages. It has already survived the mass clearing of the temperate forests. It has survived the Green Revolution and the age of monoculture. It grows now on the same riverbanks and coastal dunes it occupied before any of these events occurred. It is not waiting for permission to continue. The knowledge was never lost. It was always there. In the Tibetan medical texts, in the oral traditions of the Altai, in the Soviet wartime archives, in the quietly growing thickets along the Baltic coast that nobody bothered to catalog because nobody believed there was anything worth cataloging. It existed in the patient biological memory of a plant that has been storing sunlight and nitrogen and extraordinary compounds in its small, impossible orange berries since long before the first human hand reached out to take one. What was lost was the willingness to look. We forgot because forgetting was easier than confronting how much knowledge the world was already holding freely in places we had decided were empty. The deserts were not empty. The eroded hillsides were not empty. The frozen borderlands where nothing commercially viable would grow, they were never empty. They were full of sea buckthorn quietly doing what it has always done. The soil remembers. The plant remembers. It will be here after the systems that ignored it have come and gone. It will still be fixing nitrogen into ground that seemed spent. It will still be bearing fruit in conditions that defeat everything else. Not because it is remarkable, though it is, but because patience is not something it ever had to choose. Patience is simply what it is. We are the ones who forgot, which means we are the ones who get to remember. If something in this archive matters to you, if the knowledge held here feels worth preserving, subscribe to Ancient Food Files. Every name that stays, every story that gets told, is one more thing the silence doesn't win. The vault is open. Come inside.